Welcome to Three Devs and a Maybe. Now introducing your show hosts, Michael Budd, Fraser Hart, Lewis Gaines, and Ed Mann.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Three Devs and a Maybe. My name's Ed Mann, and today we're joined again by Brian Moses. How you doing, Brian?
Pretty good. How are you doing today?
I'm very good, thank you. Great having you on the show last time. Discussed so many interesting topics. We went back and forth afterwards. There was a couple of little audio problems that we had, but hopefully this time we'll rectify those. But going around, we say we've really enjoyed it, and it'd be great to kind of, maybe discuss some of these bits that maybe the audio didn't come out as great again, and maybe foray into more stuff. It'd be really cool and interesting, maybe if your take on EEC RAM, what it's there for, what's your opinions on it, and what was the benefit of using such a technology?
Well, ECC RAM is, the ECC stands for error checking and correction. And what happens is there's extra hardware on each stick of RAM that stores and encrypts what you're writing to the RAM and then reconciles it against itself on a continual basis. So, if you have a defect in the RAM or something environmental like radiation or cosmic rays from outer space cause a bit in your memory to flip from a 0 to 1 unexpectedly, what it can do is it can catch those errors and then it can correct for them. So, in systems where downtime is not an option, or you're handling critical data of any kind, you frequently see people using ECC RAM to protect themselves against these kind of hardware and environmental issues. Since I build a lot of, home lab type equipment, servers that you use at your house, I am not a huge proponent of ECC RAM. The technology it's the best. I mean, if you want uptime and stability and you think your data is critical, then ECC RAM is clearly the choice for you. What we've found is, over the years, memory quality has gotten better and better. So those hardware defects, those other things that were the real reason that ECC came about in the first place, they're just not as common anymore. And you've got, tools and abilities to put RAM through paces to try and find, if you've got a defective stick of RAM. And in the end, what you can wind up doing is saving quite a bit of money. The ECC RAM itself isn't expensive. It's an extra chip, so a stick of ECC RAM tends to be about 10% more than something equivalent that's non-ECC. But where you find the huge price difference is in the motherboards. You're talking about enterprise-grade workstation and server hardware, and that comes with an enterprise-grade price tag. I mean, it's a pretty significant bump. I've always said, especially, for like a NAS machine, that I think that money's better spent somewhere else to protect your data. Like an offsite backup or any kind of backup, an external hard drive that you give to a buddy on a monthly basis and rotate, back and forth. Something like that I would think would be a better spending of money so that you could protect yourselves from other kinds of dangers like yourself. With all of my computers, I'm my own biggest enemy. So what can I do to protect myself from myself? And ECC RAM just doesn't do that nearly as well.
You mentioned last time as well, all RAM used to be EEC RAM then. Is that right? In the kind of the history of the lineage, and then the technology's gradually got better that we don't require it. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it used to be that the quality of the memory was so poor that you just had to have ECC RAM. It was expected that you would have all sorts of parity errors. So they had parity in ECC RAM, and as everything's improved, as the manufacturing has improved, as the technology has improved, fewer and fewer machines are using ECC RAM.
So with ECC RAM then, like you say that the motherboard and things like that, so kind of what is it? Why then does the motherboard need to be changed? Is it because of the fact that it's got this extra chip that then it's having to start doing extra checks and things like that? And that obviously is the price bump as opposed to just the memory itself.
Yeah, I think it's not a matter of compatibility. I mean, I think that the physical layout is the same of the ECC DIMM and the non-ECC DIMM. But I think it's the underlying motherboard's chipset, which is different. It needs to support being able to use that ECC RAM and put it through its paces. And with that, just your average consumer grade chipset, motherboard's chipset just doesn't support ECC RAM.
You actually have released a blog post, I think it was a while back actually now, where you were explaining kind of why you don't propose EEC RAM. And it's interesting because looking at my build that I'm currently kind of specking out at this time, it is a price bump, and it is a significant price bump to say, oh, I want the memory. Obviously if it's an always on machine and you really want to kind of try and do the greatest and the best you can get at this time, but in a price budget, it really does hike up those prices of certain bits such as the motherboard and the memory, and it is weighing up. But you say it's probably just better off having a backup, for all other problems as well, to kind of as opposed to, you say, this once in a lifetime bit flip that could occur.
Yeah, when you're building a server at home, your cost is always going to be your first driving factor, unless you're like some uber wealthy guy. It's always going to come into effect, and it always seems like there's other ways to spend that same money that has more benefit than just ECC RAM.
Obviously, I was speaking about kind of, what I'm looking to do for my kind of server setup. And one of the things that, as the, prices is a very big consideration, is to kind of look into the second-hand market. Obviously, thing that you want is you want the, the greatest, you want EEC RAM, and you want all these kind of things, Xeon processors, and you go on eBay and you start looking through all this old hardware, and you start seeing these amazing setups, and these amazing racks and things like that. And it's, they're very enticing prices. I'm just wondering kind of what, for you, what's your experience buying secondhand hardware, and also what are the kind of things to look out for? I'm
a big fan of secondhand hardware. I wound up, on my own home lab server, I wound up buying two Xeon E5 2670 CPUs. The first version, there's a drop-in replacement for those CPUs, and I'm assuming that lots of corporations out there, lots of server support guys are going out and, taking out one CPU and putting in another CPU or something similar. Or they probably have an end of life where they expect, hey, we start using this on this day, and then X number of days later, we need to retire that hardware. And there's a secondhand market for all of that. And home users are probably ideal for like a home lab server. And if you're willing to accept the risk, I think it's a fantastic gamble. All hardware purchases, I think, are a gamble. I've bought enough hardware that's defective right from the manufacturer that I know that just because it's brand new doesn't mean it's any better than something that might be on the secondhand market. But with secondhand hardware, you don't get, the nice manufacturer's warranty. You don't get a call center of folks that you get to call on a 24-hour basis. There's a lot of things that you don't get. It's just going to be, either it works or it doesn't, and you're on your own figuring out what exactly is wrong. And if you're willing to accept that risk, then there's a huge reward in the various amounts of, enterprise-grade hardware that is entering the secondhand market through being sold off by the companies that don't need it anymore.
Yeah, because that's the thing. Like you can crawl through eBay and you can spend hours just kind of looking through all this stuff, kind of, dreaming, oh, that'd be great to have this, and this. And I'm just wondering, do you have any do's and don'ts on buying secondhand hardware? Kind of, are there things that you would be more willing to buy on a secondhand market as opposed, or is it really kind of anything you see?
Yeah, I don't know that I've actually got a rule on which components I would or wouldn't buy on the secondhand market. When I did it, I bought just the CPUs, and then I bought a brand new motherboard, and I bought brand new RAM. But I didn't even really shop for the RAM or motherboard in the secondhand market at all. So, that might just be a hole in my thinking and not necessarily something that the listeners should follow along with. As long as you're comfortable in your ability to, let's say, kind of burn in and benchmark the machine after you've built it, to the point where you've got confidence in its ability, I would say buy as many components as you're comfortable with off of the secondhand market. But what you'll probably find, and what I found, was that I wanted a motherboard of a certain form factor to fit in a certain case. And those motherboards were fewer and farther between on the secondhand market. Mostly what I was finding out there was the great big 1U rack server mount motherboard. And that wouldn't have fit in the cases that I was using. But that's certainly not to say that the motherboard that I would have used wasn't out there. I just didn't readily find it.
That is my kind of thinking, for it too as well, is that, I'm more leaning towards now kind of the idea of experimenting, looking into eBay at least. Because you can get these off the server floor, essentially, kind of ones that, these are fully built systems. And I've been reading up a little bit, and one of the negatives they do say about maybe a system like that, maybe like getting an old Dell Tower server, is that, like obviously if something goes wrong, you're paying a premium maybe on the replacement parts because it's a server grade hardware as it is. But, these are kind of rolling of the dice, as you mentioned, that you kind of have to deal with because of the fact that you are getting maybe a good deal out of it.
Exactly. Yeah. And especially when you start working with non-standard equipment, like a Dell or whatever, they're just proprietary enough that you're going to have to potentially get replacement parts directly from them and pay, like you're saying, a hefty premium. Or you'll have to decide, hey, I think the motherboard's bad and the motherboard only fits this particular case, so why don't I just buy a replacement motherboard and case and move all of the bits into my new case?
Absolutely. That's another thing kind of going through my mind is that, maybe just taking the bits you want, because I've noticed other things such as some of the Dell cases like Tower servers, which, have obviously hard drive caddies and things, but you have to buy the hard drive caddies separately. And, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, can I buy maybe secondhand hardware caddies or, in case maybe there's not, and I will have to go to Dell. So maybe moving them to another case, which is a little less kind of proprietary, and I can just, work out what I want bits, maybe I'll buy new hard drives and then I'll just take the bits I want and maybe put it into a new motherboard. You mentioned obviously the burn-in tests there, and we did discuss them last episode a bit, kind of like looking at mem tests and, your CPU, stuff like that. Do you I suppose you would spend probably a bit longer, do you reckon, when you've initially built the system using second-hand hardware, just to make sure that it is 100% working as you expect?
I don't know that I would spend extra time of it. I'm equally distrustful of new hardware and used hardware, so my testing of both would probably be about the same. But you could burn it in, let's say, 4 hours of maxing out the CPU was enough for you. You could do 6 instead. More would certainly increase your chances of finding any kind of issues that are related to, heat or usage.
And moving on from there then, so kind of looking into the hardware for buying it brand new or buying it second hand, and kind of deciding on what hardware you want and kind of comparing hardware components. And that's, again, something this week I'm spending a lot of time with, working out the versus and stuff. And you can have a lot of fun with pegging one CPU against another and seeing what kind of wins out. I ideally wanted, it'd be great to have maybe a Xeon processor with EEC memory and stuff like that. And I don't know whether my use case really warrants it. And actually, I don't know whether my actual use case will actually benefit from having such a technology, because typically it's a NAS box, but it'll be streaming a lot of Plex stuff. It'll be using the new high efficiency video codec stuff. So that, again, will require more power. In that kind of case, maybe, having more cores isn't the benefit as opposed to having a couple of quicker cores. I'm just wondering what kind of systems, like benchmark systems. I know you mentioned the Passmark system last time, and what other systems in general, with RAM, with hard drives, with any component really of a server, of a PC build, do you factor into your decision making?
Well, usually what I wind up doing is kind of like you talked about, is I write out, or think about what are my use case scenarios for the hard drives. So like you mentioned streaming, and anytime you're talking about media, you're also talking about storage. So your use case scenario is probably going to be a lot like mine for my most recent NAS build, where I said, I want storage was my number one. I mean, I want a lot of it, and I want redundancy in it. And then, like you said, you wanted to do streaming, and so I went out and said, well, I'd be streaming with Plex, so, what are Plex's hardware requirements? And they've kind of got a guideline on how much CPU you need per stream, what your pass mark score needs to be for one stream of, 1080p video. And then I said, well, I've got 3 TVs in the house and 2 computers, and there's only 2 of us here, so maybe 2 or 3 streams would be enough. And, well, what else do I want to do with this computer? Well, maybe host a virtual machine. I've got a lot of virtual machines that I'd like to build out for different projects around the house. So gathering all of those use case scenarios, you can sit down and you've got a list of things that you want to use it for, and then I usually just wind up prioritizing those things. What's most important on that list, and then, move that up to the list and make sure that you dedicate a big chunk of your budget towards whatever your top priority is, and then kind of work through it. And I've found that helps me, kind of get away from all the nitty-gritty details. You could really go down a rabbit's hole looking at all the specs and all the possible different things that you could do, and get way far away from what it is you're actually trying to accomplish.
No, absolutely. I think I'm at that point kind of, okay, I've got to make a decision. And am I right in thinking that the decision to want EEC memory means then you have to obviously get a motherboard that supports it and then also a Xeon processor? Or is it, do iSeries work in the motherboards that do typically support EEC memory?
I would do a little bit of research on that, but lots of people use just your vanilla i3, i5, i7 CPUs with ECC RAM in those motherboards. It might vary on the CPU, but it should be possible to use a lot of the off-the-shelf processors with ECC RAM.
Interesting, because that's kind of, because I was initially looking at Xeon because of this, and also the fact of it being a server and kind of experimenting with that. But I am finding that maybe the price premium of having a Xeon, maybe compared to because I've noticed the new i5, I think it's the 7600K, quite nice, and it's that now the i5 series we've all got hyper threading and things like that. So these kind of things are it's very much weighing up in its favor of being actually this looks like quite a nice CPU at a nice kind of budget to work with. Just wondering, I think we did touch about it a little bit last episode, but obviously, Xeons are kind of more pushed towards the fact of being a server grade, server hardware, and then maybe looking at the iSeries as maybe more desktop. But in builds such as a NAS or a home NAS setup and stuff, are there much differences? Would it be much greater to get a Xeon of a comparable maybe spec as an iSeries, or is it really the fact of Xeons obviously are probably built better in quotes, and maybe have a bit more stress testing and things like that before they actually get shipped out?
Yeah, I would think that the Xeon CPU in the home lab server is a really neat bragging point to your fellow home lab server enthusiasts. There's always gonna be a guy who's out there doing enterprise grade stuff at his home for fun. But I would think for the majority of everybody, you're playing, I'm gonna say consumer grade CPU is going to be absolutely fine. And I would think that you should probably only go with the Xeon CPU unless you found like I did, you found used ones whose specs meet your criteria and they're inexpensive. I wouldn't pay the premium of the brand new Xeon CPU ever. The Xeon CPUs I wound up putting in my home lab server are selling for $40 or $50 on eBay right now. Their suggested retail price was $1,500. So, one CPU would have been more than I spent on the entire machine by 50%.
That's insane, isn't it? You mentioned that your home lab, you found a blog post that kind of discussed, building this kind of system. And what did it kind of all come up to? Because I know that obviously that your DIY NAS build this year did kind of stretch the wallet a little bit with kind of its choice in CPU and motherboard.
Yeah. When I talked about setting priorities, when I built that NAS this year, I didn't put cost on there at all. It wasn't one of my priorities, and you can tell by the spec sheet that's wound up being the case. My home lab machine, I didn't really set a concrete budget, but the blog post that I'd stumbled upon had said, hey, you can build a 32 thread dual Xeon desktop computer for under $1,000. So that's kind of what I wound up working from, was around $1,000. I think it wound up coming to about $900.
Wow, that's amazing, isn't it? I mean, those are the steals that you can get out of secondhand hardware. If you do spend a little bit of time and invest a little bit, and kind of understanding what's out there and things like that. One thing, actually, again, like speaking about like CPUs maybe in more particular, is the concept of overclocking. And you hear it a lot, and you actually see it a lot, kind of like, these CPUs are overclockable, and like, you can gain a little more speed out of them. And you also then have to consider like the heat and things that are generated based on that. I'm just wondering kind of what is then overclocking, and like, have you had any experience in overclocking CPUs?
Well, overclocking is basically, the CPU runs at a certain speed, and that's set by a base frequency and a multiplier. And I can't recall all of them off of the top of my head, but you multiply X times Y, and that's how you get to 3.3 gigahertz. And those are things that you can adjust in the computer's BIOS, or it's been a long time since I did it. You actually physically did it on the motherboard via jumpers. It's been quite a while. But by changing those, you can say, hey, this CPU, which is, labeled to be, 3.2 gigahertz, by adjusting this one setting, I can overclock it and make it run like it's 3.4 gigahertz instead. And sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you wind up having system instability and crashes. And I mean, I guess there's a chance that you could go, way overboard and damage a component. But I don't think that happens all that frequently.
So it's really then kind of using hardware essentially overusing hardware.
Exactly. You're basically, when you read through people's overclocking guides, the people who do it right, they're essentially seeing how much they can get away with. And then when they've reached that point where they can't get away with any bit more, they step back a step or two and then just kind of leave it set. But yeah, you're exactly right. They wind up running something outside of its specifications of what the manufacturer says that it can run. And people probably do it with a decent amount of success. I mean, they do it with a decent enough success. There's a community. I mean, there are communities built of people who are overclocking their hardware.
I suppose it's another win that you can get. You can get a CPU that maybe has a set hardware, has a set speed, but then you're able to, speed it up and overclock it to a speed that is comparable to another CPU that would cost more and things like that. It's another win area. And one other interesting thing, and I don't know whether I'm right in thinking this, but so it's obviously big manufacturers like Intel and stuff, making different CPU sets, is quite expensive on the actual, when they're actually building them. They may build them to a certain spec, but actually almost clock them or lock them at a certain speed. And is that kind of some of the things that people do, is that they actually, maybe they have an i3 series processor X, but actually internally it may be a certain other processor, but you're able to unlock it because it's just hardware, it's software locked, or am I completely off on that one?
Yeah, I guess it would be the firmware in the BIOS, in the firmware is where, and I don't know, all throughout the years there have been different attempts by, Intel and AMD and the like to prevent overclocking. And every time some intrepid tinkerer finds a way around it, sometimes it's been, complicated. Like you have to make a modification to the CPU or I can't remember which CPU it was. There was a CPU where you had to use like a lead pencil and you would short out. You would just draw on top of the processor. You would connect two leads by coloring on it with the pencil. But yeah, I think for the most part, it's done now in the BIOS, and hardware manufacturers, motherboard manufacturers are happy to help overclockers and sell hardware to those folks who are willing to do that. So they design their BIOSes and whatnot to cater to overclockers, and that winds up making it easier for everybody.
Why doesn't everyone then overclock? Are there, obviously you've mentioned that, you can damage it and stuff, but what are like the common considerations that, maybe I buy a CPU, I overclock it. What can I expect? Is it a shorter lifespan, heat problems and things like that?
Yeah, you're running it harder and faster than it's supposed to go, so you're going to have heat. You're going to have more heat probably than if you've been running it at the recommended settings. And heat is on the top 5 enemies of computing hardware. Heat is like number 1 or 2. I mean, it's bad news. So you might have a shorter lifespan. You might have more system instability or problems like that. You'll probably, if your CPU were to die unexpectedly overnight and you called up whoever, was providing your support and say, yeah, my CPU died overnight and I was overclocking it, you're probably not going to you're probably going to void the warranty.
But then again, I suppose it's that gamble like secondhand hardware where you can probably get a bit of a steal out of it if you can find a CPU that you can overclock to a certain speed, as opposed to buying that hardware up front.
Yeah, it's a potential win, but I think in recent years that win has gotten smaller. At one point, you were overclocking CPUs that they were, I don't know about doubling or tripling, but they were running way, way faster than they were designed. I think in general, the trend has been, kind of downwards. Your return on overclocking today is way less than overclocking, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And that's probably the reason that I just don't do it anymore. It seems like there's diminishing returns on that with every generation of CPU.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if it's going to be a shorter lifespan or you're going to avoid the warranty and more heat that you're going to have to handle, as you say, it's just, there's no point in doing it if you're not going to get, I mean, if you were to get like these double or triple clock speed, improvements, that's just an insane win. And that actually is then, in the hardware when you're purchasing it. But if it's not that and it is just a slight bump, but you're kind of putting it in a risk factor, it's the pros and cons, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely a risk-reward decision that you have to make.
Are there other components? Because I'm thinking like in RAM and stuff as well. Because I mean, obviously we've spoken about comparing CPUs, but like, how do you compare RAM, or do you kind of look into RAM and like the speed that's working at, and can you overclock RAM?
Well, overclocking the CPU almost always overclocks everything to a little bit. I mean, you're running the CPU at a higher frequency, and everything that uses the CPU then is also running at a higher frequency. I don't know about individually overclocking the RAM to higher speeds. That's not going to be an area that I'm going to be able to shed a whole lot of light on. But just about anything, it seems like anything is overclockable. Your GPU's overclockable. I overclock one thing, and that's it, and that's my monitors. They were set up at I think a 60 hertz refresh rate, and I've found that my monitors at one point supported up to 120 hertz of a refresh rate, and now one of my monitors doesn't like 120 hertz anymore, so I've had to back it down to 96. And it's probably backed down to 96 because I've stressed it out and damaged it, and that's why it doesn't do 120 anymore.
Yeah, because I was going to ask about that. That probably is, again, it's that overclocking where you are using the hardware outside of its kind of intended use.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the gains that you get, for what it was, for you obviously rolled the dice and you said, it was what I wanted. So it is, I suppose it is maybe on a case-by-case basis, does overclocking work for you as opposed to, yes, you should be overclocking things. Yeah.
It's a case-by-case and cost-benefit. With the monitors that I'm using, they're a QNX 2710, I think. They're a Korean off-brand, and I've never dug into it, but I kind of suspect that They're the panels that, don't qualify for your really nice Retina displays or whatever. They're the rejects off of that manufacturer pile, and they're really inexpensive and they're overclockable. So why not? I mean, I'm getting the equivalent of a really nice display. I spend a fraction of the money. I mean, those are really, displays get really expensive, and these were hundreds of dollars compared to thousands of dollars.
Absolutely, and I think that is exactly it. And then maybe focusing more like maybe in like hard drives and things like that. I feel like with secondhand hard drives and data protection and things like that, obviously RAM is volatile, and in theory it shouldn't be storing anything. But the concept of maybe reusing a hard drive a bit scares me. Obviously if it's spinning disk as well, it's one of those other things. It could be you're wearing out the life of it. Have you ever used any secondhand hard disks or things like that?
I would never, ever, ever buy a hard drive secondhand. For that exact reason. You said it. I mean, they spin at 5,400 or 7,200 RPM. Things that spin wear down. There's no getting around it. They're only going to spin so many times. So you're basically asking for it with a used hardware or a used hard drive, I think. I would avoid a used hard drive pretty much at all costs.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that I put on as saying I probably wouldn't buy secondhand hard drives, and to be honest with you, if I'm ever selling a PC, I typically say no hard drive included, because I keep the hard drive or destroy it, because you just can't be trusted. It's just better. It's far better for your peace of mind to get rid of it.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point also.
To be honest, I'm always amazed that, especially on these server setups and stuff, that they do provide hard drives with them. We're providing with these, with obviously used hard drives. And I do think maybe, I don't know whether they should. I think, wouldn't it be better just to not include the hard drives and get rid of them just for the fact of data protection or something?
Yeah, well, that is interesting. Depending on where that hard drive originated, it's entirely possible that at some point it stored data that was important or critical to a business's needs. I'd be astonished if, anybody was selling off those hard drives. Those probably wind up in a shredder or, get drilled through, or, there's lots of ways to destroy a disk, but I would expect that most corporations are disposing of storage and not trying to resell it on the secondhand market.
Absolutely, because I know you can do in quotes secure erasing and stuff, which it will rewrite every bit on the actual disk, but there's still 100%. I'm sure there are ways of being able to recover it. And what happens if that went wrong and you didn't actually erase everything? It's just the risk. The risk of it is not worth it at all.
There's definitely some risk there, and I would imagine that most companies are weighing that before they decide how they wind up disposing of a hard drive.
It's interesting to see, actually, I suppose solid state drives is a similar thing, actually, but maybe to not as extent. Obviously it's not spinning, so you're not getting that. But again, you've only got a certain amount of writes that you can do to hardware such as that. So it is in the same ballpark. It's
a different kind of problem, but it pretty much results in the same thing. I wouldn't buy a used SSD either.
Moving on to, and we actually touched upon this a little bit again last episode, to discussing the CPU a little bit more, and really kind of the difference. Because you mentioned a 32 threads, 8 cores, I think it was you mentioned, and you said you can build this massive machine, and so what actually then is the difference between those two concepts? Okay,
well, on your CPU you've got different computing units, and that physical cores. That's what you see. It's what you see advertised. Each core is a physical, it's a little mini CPU, actually, just on the die. And then all of those work in parallel. And then each core, through hyperthreading, is able to simultaneously process 2 different instructions. And an instruction or threads. So you've got 2 threads per core via hyperthreading and multiple cores. And in my case, in my home lab CPU, or a home lab computer, you've got multiple CPUs. So in my computer, I've got 2 CPUs with 8 cores each, and then each being able to do 16 threads, because each core is capable of 2 threads simultaneously. And add it all together, that's 32 threads.
That's really interesting. And because you mentioned hyperthreading there, and I've looked into it a little bit, and it does seem, as you say, I know it's like a bit of black magic going on there. It's this kind of like surreal thing where, and actually people can see it if you go into your task manager, you assume maybe you've got an i3, with 2 physical cores, but it's coming up as 4 cores, and it's like actually 2 of those are logical, or it's 4, it's 2 real cores and then 2 logical cores, or virtual cores they call them. And I'm just wondering, is there a technology that on the AMD side, or is hyperthreading only an Intel kind of technology that's being used in those CPUs?
I would be astonished if there's not something similar to hyperthreading on AMD. I don't know right off the top of my head, but I would imagine either that they've got something equivalent or they're licensing hyperthreading from Intel.
Yeah, because it just seems like such a great technology. And the more I read into it, and like the YouTube video, I'll put some in the show notes and stuff, kind of the things I've been looking into to try and understand it. And it's that idea that, really, I suppose there's so many different analogies for it, but you say that it can do 2 actions at once. And really, it's just kind of sharing off that CPU. Within the CPU, it's got these different control units, and it can use different ones of those in one cycle. If something's trying to access something from RAM, or you're trying to process a floating point number, it can do that at the same time. I think I'm right in thinking that that's kind of what my learning at this time has got to.
That's my understanding also.
It seems like a great win. I think they have mentioned that there are some things. I mean, there's a couple of key things you need to consider, and one is the worst thing actually is if your OS doesn't support hyperthreading or doesn't understand what hyperthreading is, because it will assume, I've got 4 cores, I can just use the first 2. But actually, it really needs to know that if it's trying to do something, it's better off using if there's real cores available as opposed to using a virtual logical core. Obviously, the operating system needs to understand it, and as well as I think they mentioned that there's a bit of more heat because of, again, it's working the CPU a little bit more. Maybe it's doing something similar to overclocking. I suppose it's actually intended in this regard, but it's that kind of overworking the CPU to try and get as much efficiency out of it and no downtime.
Yeah.
Remember, we were talking about, I think we were talking about RAID. We definitely talked about RAID last time. We talked about ZFS and things like that. You mentioned actually that you use the ZFS platform and things like that. And I've noticed actually, and this was something when I was going through the Reddits, go through home server and stuff like that, people were mentioning this technology or this operating system called UmRAID. And I thought I added it into the show notes, and you were fortunate enough, you kind of said, oh yeah, but I know of it. I'm just wondering, what is UmRAID then? Because it seems so good, too good to be true. It's almost like a Drobo kind of thing where it's, it's just chuck anything at it and it will work. Yeah,
well, and that's a pretty good comparison, I would think, with the Drobo. With UnRAID, as I understand it, UnRAID's I guess effectively it's a competitor of FreeNAS. It's a standalone distribution. I don't know what operating system it's built on. But one of the advantages is that you just throw disks at it, and it maintains one drive for parity, and it allows you to mismatch any size drive that you want, and it makes it work. And that's really my extent of it. I don't know what it does if you've got 11 really small drives and 1 real big drive, how efficient it is at giving you all of that storage space back. But one of the drawbacks of your traditional RAID-based systems is that they're all built on like-sized drives being added and replaced at in the matching pairs. So if let's say you've got 10 4-terabyte drives, and you replace one of those 4-terabyte drives with an 8-terabyte drive, you won't be able to use that extra space on that 8-terabyte drive until all the other 4-terabyte drives are replaced as well. And I don't think that that's a drawback of the UnRAID system. And, in what people have commented on my blogs and I've seen written about is that it's pretty popular.
Because of this reason, isn't it? And I think it seems too good to be true almost, because with RAID, it kind of makes sense, you understand that, it's like, well, yeah, obviously everything has to be the same because I'm mirroring, or, you can kind of think of it as like, even with a parity drive, sharing out this data available in 2 different spaces. So to have this kind of, as you say, like maybe 10 small hard drives and then 1 big drive, where does it all go? I'm sure that there are some shortcomings there. I put it in quote shortcomings because any gain you get out of it is an amazing win.
The one thing that I read about it that made me nervous is that it only sounds like there's 1 drive's worth of parity data. So now I don't know this to be a fact. We'd need to dig into it a little bit. But what would happen if you lost two drives at the same time.
Absolutely, and that's what you said RAID 6 last time was, people have gone away from RAID 5 just because of that, and the fact that your hard drives are getting bigger and bigger, and we're getting, configurations that we really do want to have two parities.
Yeah, well, and keep in mind that hard drives wear out. So let's say you bought 8 brand new hard drives, and you never had a single problem, and then as those 8 hard drives got old, one wore out and failed. Well, when you replaced it, you would have to use those other 7 drives to rebuild that 8th drive and repair the array. Those other 7 drives have to work harder to rebuild the array. And if they're all already aging as it is, you're putting them under more stress, and you're more likely to have another failure during that rebuild. So that's why I prefer the, RAID 6 or RAID Z2 is what they call it on ZFS, so that you have a second drive's worth of parity data. So if you happen to lose that drive during that rebuild, you wouldn't be, up a creek.
You know what? That's a really good point, because people think, oh, what's the bad? That's such bad luck to have a failed drive, and then during the repair of that failed drive, you get another one. But as you say, the hardware's working harder, and if they're of equal kind of age, this could happen. You could actually just have this horrible toppling effect where every time you're trying to repair. And I suppose once I don't know, actually, with a RAID 5 setup, like if maybe then if I do actually have double parity, remember 2 hard drives fail, so I have one fail, I then decide, okay, yeah, I can repair that now. During that one fails, can I get back my storage? Like, can I get back at least what I can get back of it? Obviously, it won't be 100%, or is it completely gone now? Is there all or nothing kind of thing to it?
I would say plan to be rebuilding that everything would be gone. If you have RAID 5 and you lose one drive, and then you lose another drive while you're rebuilding it, you're going to have a really hard time recovering any of the data off of that. I don't want to say that it's impossible, but you should plan as if it would be impossible.
My kind of thinking now is go RAID 6, and also not take that as being a backup, because I think that's where some people, even with the Drobo, kind of think of it as, oh yeah, it's fine because I'm using a Drobo or I'm using this kind of RAID system, it's my backup for me. It's like, no, that's just dealing with the hardware side. Locally, you really need backups, external backups as well. And, the beautiful thing of something like ZFS is it deals with bit rot as well, and these kind of things which RAID on its own doesn't deal with.
Yeah, RAID in any form is only minimizing your downtime. You can survive losing a hard drive without having to, shut everything down and repair and recover. You can do that on the fly, but it is not a backup. It is not a substitute for a backup. It doesn't offer you any sort of protection against any of the number of things that backups protect you against. I mentioned earlier in the show, I'm my own worst enemy. I'm going to go in there and delete that file that I shouldn't have deleted. And RAID is going to let me do that every time I try and do it. It's, yep, you want to delete a file? Okay, it's deleted. It's gone forever. Oh, wait, sorry. I didn't mean that. The only saving me from that is having a backup somewhere else, hidden away from myself, so that I can't do that damage there.
And, you mentioned that you got FreeNAS there, and you currently use FreeNAS. Obviously, there's Unraid, but are there any other distributions that you've used in the past before you settled on FreeNAS, or was that really the first one and the only one you've kind of looked into for your NAS builds?
FreeNAS was the one that I was aware of when I went to build my NAS, and I kind of went into it with, well, I'm going to try FreeNAS out, and if there's anything I don't like about it, I'll consider one of the alternatives. And I've personally loved FreeNAS. There are a number of NAS-driven distributions like FreeNAS. There's NAS for Free. There's Open Media Vault. There is Xpenology. I don't know how you say it. I know how to type it, but I don't know how it's pronounced. Which is essentially a port or a version of what Synology puts on their off-the-shelf NAS machines. And I'm sure there are others that I'm forgetting. But yeah, there are a lot of competitors to FreeNAS, and I've tried a few of them and liked a few of them, but not enough to replace FreeNAS, in my opinion.
Yeah, because I mean, is FreeNAS the only one that gives you ZFS, or do some of the others?
There's a NAS for free, which is a fork of FreeNAS of its own, and it supports ZFS. And there are operating systems out there that support ZFS also. If you were up for it and you wanted to build a server from scratch and put what components you want on it, you could get ZFS without using, FreeNAS or NAS for free. But what FreeNAS, to me, the beauty of FreeNAS and NAS for free and these other NAS distributions is it's got a nice web UI that minimizes the amount of time that you have to spend at the command line. And it essentially winds up opening it up to guys like me who probably don't have that much experience, with FreeBSD, which is what FreeNAS runs under, or, these other Linux distributions that might be running underneath these NAS distributions, and kind of just lets you set it up like an appliance rather than, building something from scratch. If you had a FreeBSD install, you could go out and you could stick FreeBSD, and you could download all of these components that you need, and you could set up your own server from scratch. I don't know about you, but it would take me forever to do that. I mean, it would be frustrating. I'd have to be learning a whole bunch of new things. And while I'm sure it would be worth it in the long run to learn all of that stuff, I'm not sure if I would be very pleasant to be around, between start and finish. And that's really what I like about, FreeNAS and the other things, is that it really just turns it into an appliance where you sit down, you boot it up, you go to a web UI, you turn things on, you configure things, and it does all of the command line stuff for you behind the scenes, and it works. And that's a huge relief.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's one thing I've just thought of, actually. So, you've got ZFS, but there's another one called ButterFS. And I've completely put you on the spot here. I just have you ever had any experience with ButterFS?
I have no experience with ButterFS. I am aware that it exists.
That's my kind of understanding at the moment. It's something that, this is the thing. Once you go down this rabbit hole of starting to look into things, you start hearing terminology and you need different technologies, and it's something, that, maybe you give that a look. And people seem to be saying, that's obviously got a lot of good potential as well. But I think for me at this moment in time, when I'm doing my build, I will be sticking with FreeNAS and ZFS.
Yes. Yeah. They've been around forever, and they're fundamentally sound.
Brilliant. And I couldn't have you on the show again without talking about something completely outside of all that, of all the server stuff. We spoke about coffee last episode, and this time I've got to talk about your foraying into quadcopters. You seem to have built your own one or something crazy like that. Like, what drew you to do something like that? It looks really cool.
Well, the makerspace that I participate in here, we have a almost yearly event, a trebuchet event. People build their own trebuchets, and we have a park that we go to, and we launch pumpkins. It's a lot like pumpkin chunkin', but it's regional, it's different, and it's trebuchets only, so gravity-based siege weaponry. And at our most recent one last year, one of the members brought out his DJI Phantom quadcopter, and he was demonstrating it. It's an aerial photography quadcopter, and it has some really cool features. And he's quadcopter crazy. I mean, he's got all of this stuff, and he was talking to us, and then he said, "Well, you could build something like this pretty easily, and I really recommend it." And he pointed out, he said, if you have a quadcopter, you're gonna crash it. And the only way that you're going to be able to fix it is you're going to have to go to this manufacturer and buy just like, with the Dell hardware, you have to buy their proprietary stuff. He said, or you could buy parts, these kits. They're all standardized. They're roughly equivalent. And if you break it, he pointed at all the parts in the arm. It would be $10 to replace this, $15 to replace that, and, another $10 to replace this, and you'd have it fixed. And then he said, and if you're learning, you're going to break it. You're absolutely going to break it. I mean, there's no way around it. You're going to break it. So why not build it so you know how to fix it, rather than, buy somebody else's design, break it, and then be stuck in this cycle of learning, breaking, and repairing. So what he did is he led a class at our makerspace, and he basically sent us a parts list and said, you buy these parts, and then one weekend we'll get together, we'll build it, we'll configure it, and I'll give you the real quick tutorial on how to fly a quadcopter. And ever since then, we've been nuts about quadcopters. I mean, we've been doing a bi-weekly quadcopter flying event where we've got 4 or 5 people out there, and it seems like we have a dozen quadcopters between the 4 or 5 of us, and we have spectators that show up just because they're interested. It's a whole lot of fun. I've written a couple quadcopter blogs here the last month, and I've got, well, it seems like an unending list of other quadcopter topics I want to write about in the future.
Really interesting, and it is a lot harder. And as you say, things will break. It's not out the question there that things will break.
Yeah, the batteries you get about, well, it depends on the size of the battery, but you get about 5 to 10 minutes of flight time out of a battery. The first 4 or 5 times we went, I crashed and broke something before expending my first battery.
Oh, no.
Literally, I was in a cycle of fly it, crash it, be done for the day, order replacement parts, fix it, fly it, crash it, and maybe I'm a bad pilot. I hope so, but I would plan for that, because it's a lot harder than the people I've seen it make it look.
It's one of those skills, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. People make it look too easy, which makes it too enticing to think, oh yeah, it's fine. Well, where do you actually fly it then? Do you fly it in a nice clear area, like a nice green grass, or do you kind of try and maneuver in and out of busy places?
Yes, we do both. When we've been learning, we've gone to nice big open parks, where there's no people around, and we usually have somebody who kind of functions as a spotter so that we can stay away from other people. But we've got guys who have really fast drones that are really maneuverable, that, they go down into not exactly a forest, but a wooded area with sparse trees, and fly in and out, around the tree trunks, or up over branches, or between things. I mean, we even have, little tiny micro drones that we fly, in houses, or, around yards. We try and look for different challenges of different environments.
Absolutely, that sounds so much fun. And all these have you built then, or have you bought any kind of pre-built ones?
We've got a few DIY designs, but we've gotten to the point now where we're getting comfortable enough that we're also buying some of the pre-built ones to kind of save on some of that labor.
No, absolutely, and I think, as you say, it's a great learning. It's learning what the technology is like, building it up, and really, breaking it and being able to fix it. It's a lot more confident in, the fact of actually using it. Because if you're buying this really expensive piece of machinery and then you're worrying to actually try and learn and use it, you're not going to get the enjoyment out of it as you would if you could just, it's just something that I can play around with.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't care if I wreck it because I know I can fix it, is kind of my, well, can I fit in there? And then you decide, well, yeah, I can fix it if I can't. So I'm going to just go ahead and try it.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you so much again, Brian, for taking the time to come on the show. It's really interesting. Last episode was great. Today was great. And it's so much fun talking about server stuff and just everything. Yeah.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
No, brilliant. Well, audience, it's been another great episode, and we'll speak to you again next week.
You've been listening to 3 Devs and a Maybe. You can contact us at contact@3devsandamaybe.com or follow us on Twitter at 3 Devs and a Maybe.